Just before dawn on March 24, 1945, German artillery officers stationed along the eastern bank of the Rhine River were lifting their binoculars and freezing in place. Across the misted floodplain near the town of Viersen, in the lower Rhine Valley north of Cologne, they could see the unmistakable silhouettes of an American armored buildup. Sherman tanks lined up nose to tail. Anti-aircraft batteries pointed skyward, trucks moving in long, disciplined columns. Engineers stacking pontoon bridge sections by the riverbank. Through the night, their listening posts had reported the thunder of tank engines, the clatter of treads on gravel, the shouts of work crews assembling boats. Their radio interceptors had pulled in a steady stream of American transmissions, call signs they recognized, units they had been tracking for weeks. Every instinct, every piece of evidence, every report from every observation post told them the same thing. The American Ninth Army was about to cross the Rhine, right here, right in front of them. They were wrong about all of it. Almost everything they were looking at was a lie. The tanks were rubber, the artillery was inflatable, the radio traffic was theatre. The sounds rolling across the river had been recorded months earlier in a sound studio at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and were being broadcast through 500-pound speakers mounted on the back of half-tracks. The men in American uniforms were not the divisions they pretended to be. They were artists, painters, fashion designers, sound engineers, architects. Just over 1,100 of them in total, performing the largest and most successful battlefield illusion ever attempted by the United States Army. And the real Ninth Army was already crossing the Rhine, 10 miles to the north, almost completely unopposed. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the unit that made German intelligence officers question their own eyes, their own ears, and the very nature of reality itself. For more than 50 years after the war, almost no one knew they had ever existed. The official designation was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It was activated on January 20, 1944, at Camp Forrest, Tennessee. Its authorized strength was 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. Combined with its sister unit, the 3,133rd Signal Service Company, which fielded 10 officers and 192 men in Italy, the total complement of what would later be known as the Ghost Army came to roughly 1,300 soldiers. To put that number in perspective, a full American infantry division in World War II contained around 15,000 men. An armored division was even larger. And yet this single, undersized special unit was designed to do something no one had ever attempted at this scale. It was built to impersonate entire divisions, to project the illusion of 30,000 men where in reality there were only a few hundred, to make the enemy see armies that did not exist, hear movements that were never made, and react to threats that were not real. The unit was the brainchild of two men. The first was Major Ralph Ingersoll, a former managing editor of The New Yorker in the late 1920s, who later helped devise the editorial formula for Fortune magazine, served as general manager of Time Incorporated, and in 1940 founded the innovative New York City newspaper called PM. Before the war, Ingersoll had been a creative force in American journalism, a man who understood storytelling, theater, and the manipulation of perception at the deepest level. The second was Colonel Billy Harris, a West Point graduate and career Army officer stationed in London. Harris served as Ingersoll's superior in the Special Plans branch of the 12th Army Group. While the two collaborated with the British on the deception that would convince Hitler the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, Ingersoll became fascinated by the idea of weaponizing illusion on a tactical scale. He pitched the concept of a mobile, multidisciplinary deception unit, one that could move from front to front, putting on what he called a traveling roadshow. With Harris's help, he convinced the army to adopt the plan. Ingersoll later referred to the unit as his con artists and called its creation his only original contribution to the war effort. Command of the 23rd was given to Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a veteran officer who had served as an infantry officer in France during World War I, and who had previously commanded the 46th Armoured Infantry Regiment of the 5th Armoured Division. Reeder had to wrap his head around something the United States Army had never quite seen before. His unit was officially a combat formation, but it was not built to fight in the conventional sense. It was built to perform. The men he was given were unlike any other soldiers in the European theatre. The recruiters had pulled them from art schools, advertising agencies, theatre companies, and engineering programs. According to Captain Fred Fox's official history, the largest subunit of the 23rd, the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, was composed mainly of artists from New York and Philadelphia, with an average IQ of 119, one of the highest of any unit in the entire United States Army. Among the enlisted men were future legends of American culture, Bill Blass, who would become one of the most influential fashion designers of the 20th century; Ellsworth Kelly, who would emerge as one of the most important abstract painters of the post-war era; Arthur Singer, who would later illustrate the State Birds and Flowers postage stamp series; Art Kane, who would become the photographer behind the iconic 1958 portrait of jazz legends gathered on a stoop in Harlem; Jack Macy, who would later collaborate with Buckminster Fuller and Charles Ames on landmark United States pavilions at World's Fairs; Bernie Bluestein, an art student from the Cleveland Institute of Art; Arthur Shilstone, a young illustrator; Harold Lehner, a painter; and Seymour Nussenbaum, a student at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. These were the soldiers of the Ghost Army. Their weapons were paintbrushes, sketch pads, slide rules, microphones, and an unshakable belief that perception could be engineered as precisely as any artillery shell. The unit was organized into 4 distinct components, each handling a different layer of the illusion. The largest of these was the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, with around 379 men. This was the visual deception arm. Their job was to build, deploy, and maintain the inflatable rubber decoys that became the most famous symbol of the Ghost Army. Inflatable Sherman tanks, modeled with extraordinary detail to match the real M4 down to the smallest features. Inflatable artillery pieces, inflatable trucks, inflatable jeeps, inflatable airplanes that could be set up on fake airfields. The decoys could be inflated by air compressors in just a few minutes, allowing entire phantom divisions to appear and disappear in a matter of hours. The second component was the Signal Company Special, with around 296 men, which handled what the men called spoof radio. They were trained to imitate, with surgical precision, the unique fingerprint of specific American radio operators from real combat units. Every Morse code operator has what is called a fist, a personal rhythm and cadence as distinctive as handwriting. German radio interception services, who had been listening to American transmissions for years, could often identify individual operators by their fist alone. The men of the Ghost Army's Signal Company studied recordings of real operators from the units they would later impersonate, learning to mimic their style so closely that even when those real operators went silent, the German listeners would still believe they were hearing the same units, in the same locations, doing the same routine business. The Ghost Army did not just create fake radio traffic, they stole the voices of entire divisions. The third component was the 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special, with around 145 men. This was the Sonic Deception Unit, and they were arguably the most technologically advanced piece of the entire operation. Sonic deception was a brand new field of military science, and the technology behind it had to be invented almost from scratch. Training and development was directed by Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh at the Army Experimental Station at Pine Camp in upstate New York, now known as Fort Drum. Rayleigh was a colorful American journalist who, before the war, had recruited Amelia Earhart in 1928 to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, launching her career as a transatlantic aviator. He had also served as a fundraiser and publicity man for Admiral Byrd's Antarctic expeditions. The Army had given him the task of turning sound itself into a weapon of war. To do this, the Army turned to Bell Telephone Laboratories, the legendary research arm of the American telephone industry. Bell Labs sent a team of engineers, along with a complete mobile recording studio, down to Fort Knox, Kentucky. There, in early 1944, they recorded the sounds of real American armored and infantry units in motion, tanks rolling on gravel, trucks shifting gears, men shouting orders. Engineers building pontoon bridges, the clatter of hammers on steel. They had to solve technical problems no one had ever faced before. Driving a truck past a stationary microphone produces an audible Doppler shift, the rise and fall in pitch you hear when a car passes you on the highway, which would have given any recording away as a fake. The Bell Labs engineers solved this elegantly by placing the microphone at the center of a large circle and driving the vehicles around it at constant distance. There was no Doppler shift. The recordings were captured first on 16-inch transcription discs, the highest fidelity recording medium of the era, but records were useless on a battlefield. They would skip if a shell landed nearby, or if the half-track hit a bump. Magnetic tape did not yet exist as a practical recording medium. The solution was wire recording. The sound was transferred onto extremely thin steel wire, less than 1/1000th of an inch thick, that moved through the playback head at a blistering 5 feet per second to maintain audio fidelity. Each spool held 2 miles of wire and gave roughly 30 minutes of playback. Different sounds, recorded separately, could be mixed together for each specific deception. If the operation was meant to simulate a tank battalion moving up to a river crossing, the sound engineers would mix recordings of tanks with recordings of pontoon construction, layered with the voices of men. This is, according to historians at the National World War II Museum, one of the earliest documented examples of multi-track sound mixing anywhere in the world. The wire recordings were then played back through 500-watt amplifiers connected to enormous speakers, each weighing roughly 500 pounds. The speakers were mounted in the bed of M3A1 half-tracks, the same tracked vehicles used by regular American infantry. The speakers could be folded down inside the bed, making the half-tracks look identical to thousands of others in the European theatre. When deployment time came, the soldiers used a hand crank, which they nicknamed the coffee grinder, to raise the speakers into firing position. The system was so powerful that the broadcasts could be heard clearly 15 miles away. Each sonic half-track was rigged with self-destruct charges. Pull a lever, and 15 seconds later the secret electronics inside would be destroyed before they could fall into enemy hands. Bell Labs engineers also developed firing tables for the sonic units, similar to the artillery firing tables used by gunners, calibrating volume and angle based on terrain, wind speed, humidity, and distance to the target. Each sonic vehicle was accompanied by a mobile weather station, so the operators could adjust their broadcasts in real time. Lieutenant John Walker of the 3132nd later described it simply. We could go in at night and crank the speakers up out of the back of the half-track and play a program to the enemy all night of us bringing equipment into the scene, and we could make them believe that we were coming in with an armoured division. The fourth component of the Ghost Army was the 406th Engineer Combat Company, commanded by Captain George Rebb, with around 168 men. Rebb had graduated from West Point in January of 1943 with the accelerated wartime class and would later rise to the rank of Major General. His company's job was security. They were the only members of the Ghost Army who looked and fought like a normal combat unit. They guarded the perimeter of every deception site, kept curious civilians and enemy patrols away from the inflatable tanks and sonic half-tracks, and were the first line of defense if a German raid penetrated the illusion. Together, these 4 units formed something that had never existed before in modern American warfare: a complete, self-contained, multi-sensory deception machine. To understand why the Ghost Army existed, you have to understand the strategic situation the Allies faced in 1944. The war in Europe was approaching its decisive phase. The D-Day landings were being planned in absolute secrecy. The success of Operation Overlord depended in large part on a vast British-led strategic deception called Operation Fortitude, which had convinced the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would land at the Pas de Calais rather than at Normandy. The British had pioneered tactical deception during the North African campaign, particularly through the work of Brigadier Dudley Clark and his unit known as a Force, who in late 1942 ran Operation Bertram before the Battle of El Alamein. There, the British Eighth Army had used dummy tanks, fake supply dumps, and false radio traffic to convince Field Marshal Erwin Rommel that the attack was coming from a different direction than it actually was. The lessons learned in the desert had been studied carefully by American planners, and the Ghost Army was, in many ways, the American answer to the British template. It is important to be clear about what the Ghost Army did and did not do in those early months. The 23rd was a small contributor to Operation Fortitude before D-Day, but the heavy lifting on the Pas de Calais deception was done by British-turned agents like Garbo, by the London Controlling Section, and by signal units in southeast England. The 23rd signature work would only begin after D-Day, but once it began, it would not stop. The unit shipped out of New York in early May of 1944. They arrived in the United Kingdom and were quartered at Walton Hall near Stratford-upon-Avon, the birthplace of Shakespeare, which several of the men later remarked was an oddly appropriate setting for a unit of theatrical deceivers. Then, shortly after the Normandy landings, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops crossed the English Channel and entered the war for real. Their first major operation was called Operation Elephant, beginning on July 1, 1944, in the Cerisy Forest of Normandy. Their mission was to take over the positions of the real 2nd Armoured Division, which was being secretly moved to the front line. The Ghost Army was supposed to convince German aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence that the 2nd Armoured was still in reserve in the Cerisy Forest, when in reality it had moved out. Operation Elephant was, by the unit's own assessment, a failure, or more accurately, a learning experience. The deception was actually too perfect. The camouflage was too neat. The inflatable tanks had been parked in immaculate rows, the way real tanks would never actually be parked in a combat zone. Real units made mistakes. Real units left tracks in the mud, scattered cigarette butts, dug latrines in the wrong places. There were also serious security problems. French civilians wandered into the deception area, and at one point a curious Frenchman walked up and bumped into the barrel of an inflatable tank, bending it over and revealing the rubber underneath. Another patrol watched 2 Frenchmen on bicycles stop and stare as 4 American soldiers casually lifted what was supposed to be a 40-ton Sherman tank by hand. The unit realized that fooling the enemy was not just a matter of building convincing decoys. It was a matter of stagecraft, of theater, of giving the audience just enough imperfection to convince them they were seeing the real thing. The man who articulated this insight most clearly was Lieutenant Fred Fox, a 1939 graduate of Princeton University and a member of the Princeton Triangle Club, the oldest collegiate musical comedy troupe in America. Fox had a background in theater, and he understood instinctively what the unit was missing. In a memo sent under the name of Colonel Reeder, Fox wrote that the attitude of the 23rd Headquarters towards their mission was lopsided. There was too much military and not enough showmanship. Like it or not, he wrote, the unit had to consider itself a traveling roadshow, ready at a moment's notice to present a complete performance, impersonating any real combat division in the United States Army. The presentations had to be done with the greatest accuracy and attention to detail. This memo became the philosophical core of the Ghost Army. From that point forward, the unit thought of itself less as soldiers and more as actors. Each deception was a production. The inflatable tanks were the props. The sonic recordings were the soundtrack. The radio operators were voice actors. The men themselves wore the patches and uniforms of the divisions they were impersonating, and they sat in cafes and bars in nearby towns talking loudly, in ways calculated to drop hints to any local German sympathizer who might be listening. They drove jeeps with bumper markings of fake units. They posed as colonels and generals when they were actually privates and corporals. The entire unit became a touring theatrical company whose audience was the German Wehrmacht. Through the summer and fall of 1944, the Ghost Army carried out operation after operation across France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Each one taught the unit something new. They learned that German aerial reconnaissance flew with predictable schedules, and they timed their inflations to be visible just as the German cameras were overhead. They learned that German signals intelligence preferred to identify operators rather than units, so they obsessed over the fingerprint of every radio man they impersonated. They learned that German intelligence reports often relied on civilian observation, on the testimony of farmers and shopkeepers who had seen American soldiers passing through their villages. So the Ghost Army began deliberately staging visible movements through towns, with men wearing the patches of divisions that were elsewhere, drinking in cafes, asking questions, leaving false trails of conversation. They became experts at what intelligence professionals would later call atmospherics, the mood, the texture, the small human details that made an army feel real to anyone watching from outside. The operation that came to define the unit, and that gave them their hardest lesson in the dangers of their work, was Operation Bettemberg. From September 15 to September 22, 1944, the Third Army, under General George Patton, was racing across France, but the line was overextended. There was a roughly 70-mile gap in the front near Bettemberg, in Luxembourg, that General Patton needed to cover, but he had no troops to spare. The Ghost Army was given an extraordinary mission: hold a stretch of front line, alone, by pretending to be the entire 6th Armored Division. For 7 days and nights, just over 1,000 men did the work of 15,000. Their inflatable tanks lined the front. Their sonic half-tracks broadcast the sounds of armor moving up. Their radio operators created the illusion of a full divisional headquarters with all its supporting traffic. Officers wearing the patches of the 6th Armored drove around in jeeps, visible to any German agent watching, and it worked. But the mission also revealed the terrifying vulnerability of what the Ghost Army did. They were a thin tissue of illusion stretched across a real battlefield, and if the Germans ever pierced the veil and realized what they were facing, the Ghost Army had almost no actual combat power to defend themselves. Just the small security force of the 406th Engineer Combat Company. By the 7th day, the Germans were beginning to probe the line. The bluff was wearing thin. And then, just in time, the real 83rd Infantry Division arrived to take over the position. The Ghost Army melted away into the night. Bettenberg also produced one of the strangest and most flattering footprints the 23rd left in the war. The deception was so persuasive that the real 6th Armored Division afterwards picked up a German nickname, the Phantom Division. The Germans had come to believe that this American armored formation could appear and disappear at will, materializing in places it had no right to be. They did not know that the unit they were tracking was sometimes real, and sometimes a small group of artists with rubber and steel wire pretending to be it. Through the winter of 1944 and into early 1945, the Ghost Army carried out a series of deceptions across the front. There was Operation Wiltz in October. There were 3 concurrent deceptions called Elsenborn, Casanova, and Dallas in November. There was Operation Koblenz in early December, and Operation Kodak during the Battle of the Bulge, which used radio deception to help mask Patton's Third Army wheeling north to relieve the besieged American forces at Bastogne. There was Operation Metz II in early January, Operation Flaxweiler later that same month, and a string of operations in February and early March named Whipsaw, Merzig, Lochinvar, and Bouzonville. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed in action during the war. Private Chester Pelliccioni, a half-track driver in the 3132nd Signal Service Company, was killed on January 9, 1945, during Operation Metz II, when a fire he had built to keep warm exploded an unseen German grenade. Captain Thomas G. Wells, an earnest young commanding officer of the 23rd Headquarters Company, and Staff Sergeant George C. Peddle, an enterprising radio platoon sergeant from the Signal Company Special, were killed on March 12, 1945, near Picard, Germany, during Operation Bouzonville. That mission, which lasted 33 hours, was the most costly the 23rd would ever conduct. Dozens more were wounded across the unit's various operations during the war. These were not safe assignments. The men of the Ghost Army operated in some of the most dangerous terrain on the European front, with almost no defensive capability of their own, and their work required them to deliberately attract enemy attention. They were drawing fire on purpose, hoping the fire would land on rubber tanks rather than real ones. Sometimes it landed on them. The men who served knew, too, that if the Germans ever discovered who they really were, the consequences could be catastrophic. Bernie Bluestein, the young art student from Cleveland who enlisted in the unit at the age of 19, said many years later that if he had known the full risks before he signed up, he probably would have made a different decision. The Nazis, he understood, would have retaliated brutally if they had ever realized that small bands of artists and designers had been making fools of the Wehrmacht for nearly a year. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its endgame. The Allies had broken through the Siegfried Line. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were pushing toward the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The First Army had achieved a stunning success on March 7 by capturing the railroad bridge at Remagen before the Germans could destroy it, allowing American forces to pour across the Rhine. But the 9th United States Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, had been held up on the western bank. Simpson's army was preparing for a major crossing operation, a key component of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder. The problem was that the Germans knew the crossing was coming. The Rhine is a wide, fast-flowing river, and any major crossing operation requires enormous preparation, masses of pontoon equipment, large concentrations of artillery and armor, hospitals, supply dumps, all of it visible. The German command had been watching the Ninth Army for weeks, trying to determine exactly where the crossing would happen and when. Wherever they identified the crossing point, they could move their reserves there, dig in their artillery, and turn the river crossing into a bloodbath. Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly, the 23rd's liaison officer attached to the planning section of the Ninth Army, conceived a deception plan to solve this problem. The operation would be called Viersen, named after a German city in the lower Rhine Valley north of Cologne. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. The real crossing would take place in the zone held by the 16th Corps, in the northernmost sector of the Ninth Army's front. But the Ghost Army, working in concert with elements of the real Ninth Army, would create the illusion that the main crossing was actually going to happen 10 miles to the south, in the 13th Corps zone, near the city of Viersen. They would simulate the presence of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, two of the actual divisions assigned to the real crossing, in the wrong place. They would pull German attention, German artillery, and German reserves away from the real crossing point and concentrate them in the wrong sector. Operation Viersen ran from March 18 to March 24, 1945. It was the largest, most complex, and most ambitious deception ever attempted by the Ghost Army. For 7 days, the men of the 23rd put on the performance of their lives. They deployed more than 600 inflatable tanks, trucks, jeeps, and aircraft along a long stretch of the Rhine. They installed 64 inflatable 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 16 inflatable 90mm anti-aircraft guns. They built dummy artillery emplacements that mirrored exactly what was being constructed in the real crossing zone. They built dummy tank destroyer positions. They set up phony divisional headquarters and staffed them with officers pretending to be colonels of the impersonated divisions. The radio operators broadcast a steady stream of fake traffic, perfectly matching the operational signature of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. The sonic half-tracks rolled up to the riverbank night after night and broadcast the unmistakable sounds of pontoon construction, vehicle movement, and combat engineering. Real anti-aircraft units, attached to the deception, opened up periodic fierce demonstrations of firepower that, according to the official report, rivaled the activity at Normandy. To complete the picture, 2 real battalions of infantry, drawn from the 84th and 102nd Infantry Divisions, were attached to the phony divisions to give the impression of genuine troop concentrations. The real 83rd Infantry Division was pulled back to give the impression of being in reserve behind the supposed crossing point. Even the Allied Tactical Air Support, flown by the 29th Tactical Air Command under Brigadier General Richard Nugent, deliberately conducted reconnaissance flights over the deception zone at the same intensity as over the real crossing zone, so that German radar would see no difference. Army medical installations were positioned to suggest the attack was coming in the 13th Corps area. Only one evacuation hospital was set up forward in the 16th Corps zone, the area where the real attack would actually launch. It was, in the words of the official army history of the 23rd, the unit's last deceptive effort, and fortunately, it was their best. The 23rd had reached the highest state of efficiency it would ever achieve, and every single deceptive capability it had was committed to this one operation. The Germans bought the illusion completely. Their reconnaissance aircraft flew over the deception zone and photographed what they believed to be massive American buildup. Their artillery began to register on the dummy positions. At one point, a German artillery barrage came down on a Ghost Army position. The shrapnel punctured several inflatable tanks, but the men of the 603rd Camouflage Battalion patched and re-inflated them before sunrise, so that the German aerial reconnaissance the next morning would see no change. In an extraordinary moment, an actual American reconnaissance plane, whose pilot had not been briefed on the deception, attempted to land at one of the fake airfields, completely fooled by the inflatable aircraft scattered across the runway. The German command pulled reserves toward the supposed crossing point near Viersen. Artillery was repositioned. Infantry was redeployed. Defensive preparations were intensified at exactly the wrong place. Then, on March 24, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, 10 miles to the north of where the Germans were expecting them. The opposition was, in the words of the National World War II Museum, virtually non-existent. The crossing went smoothly, with American casualties on the first day measured in dozens rather than the thousands that had been feared. The Allies poured into the German heartland, and within weeks the German army in the west would collapse entirely. The most stunning evidence of the deception's success arrived shortly after the crossing began. Intelligence officers from the real 79th Infantry Division captured a German order of battle map. On the map, the 79th was placed roughly where the Ghost Army had portrayed it, 10 miles south of where it had actually crossed. The 30th Infantry Division, the other unit the 23rd had impersonated, was missing from the German map entirely. The Germans had lost track of an entire American division in the most heavily reconnoitred theatre of the war. The Ninth Army's intelligence section concluded, in writing, that there was no doubt Operation Viersen had materially assisted in deceiving the enemy as to the real dispositions and intentions of the army. The 30th Division's intelligence section reported simply that the attack had come as a complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. On March 29, 1945, Lieutenant General William H. Simpson, the commander of the 9th United States Army, formally commended the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops for their part in the Rhine crossing. The 23rd had been attached to his army on March 15, he wrote, to participate in a special project that was an important part of the operation. He praised the careful planning, minute attention to detail, and diligent execution of the unit's tasks. The deception had succeeded so completely that he wanted it formally recognized. Years later, an army analyst named Mark Cronman, working on a classified study of tactical deception in the European theatre, wrote a single line that has come to define the Ghost Army's legacy. Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. While the 23rd was finishing its work in Germany, its sister unit was waging its own campaign of illusion in Italy. The 3133rd Signal Service Company, commanded by Major John Williams, had sailed for Naples aboard the troopship General Brooke on March 1, 1945. Their equipment was different. To avoid drawing attention, the 3133rd had mounted its sonic gear inside M10 tank destroyers, with the real cannons replaced by dummy guns to make room for amplifiers and speakers. The men nicknamed these vehicles the Slugs. In April 1945, the 3133rd ran a deception in the Serchio River Valley as part of the larger Allied push against the German Gothic Line. They simulated a phantom American armored division moving up the valley from Bagni di Lucca to Barga. The real attack came elsewhere, against the coast. After the war, the German commander of the 148th Grenadier Division, Lieutenant General Otto Fretta-Pico, openly admitted that he had been fooled. He had believed the dummy armored division was real, and he had delayed moving his reserve units from the Serchio Valley toward the coast for 2 days. By the time he realized his mistake, the real attack had succeeded. Of 35 inflatable tanks the 3133rd had put into the field, 24 were knocked out by German artillery fire that had been intended for real American armor. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was deactivated on September 15, 1945, after the Japanese surrender ended the war. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn. After the war, the men of the Ghost Army went home. They took off their uniforms. They went back to their lives. Bill Blass started a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly began making the paintings that would eventually hang in the Museum of Modern Art. Arthur Singer painted birds for postage stamps and field guides. Bernie Bluestein went into industrial design. Art Kane became a celebrated freelance photographer, whose work appeared in Life, Esquire, and Look magazines. They got married, they raised children, they built careers, and they did not tell a single soul what they had done. The entire story of the Ghost Army was classified top secret. The men were ordered, under threat of severe penalty, to never discuss the unit, the operations, the technology, or even its existence with anyone, including their own families. The United States military, looking ahead to the Cold War, understood that tactical deception was going to be a critical capability against the Soviet Union. The techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army, the inflatable decoys, the sonic deception, the impersonation of radio operators, were too valuable to give up. So the Army simply pretended the 23rd had never existed. The unit's deception equipment was repurposed for post-war training programs, where it was used to create simulated enemy forces for American troops to practice fighting against. The men themselves were forbidden to speak. For more than 50 years, This silence held. Sons and daughters of Ghost Army veterans grew up knowing only that their fathers had been in the army during World War II. The specifics were vague, evasive. Some men told their families they had been in the camouflage corps. Others said they had worked in signals. Some said nothing at all. Lieutenant Fred Fox, the Princeton man who had written the showmanship memo, became a special assistant in the Eisenhower White House in the 1950s. He tried, twice, to convince the Army to declassify the story so that he could write a book about what the 23rd had done. The Army refused. Fox went back to his civilian life as the unofficial keeper of Princetoniana, and the story remained sealed. A few cracks in the secrecy appeared over the decades. In April of 1985, Smithsonian Magazine published a feature article on the unit. The illustrations and first-hand testimony were provided by Arthur Shilstone, a Ghost Army veteran. The article was the first widely circulated public account of the unit, but it passed largely unnoticed by the wider American public, and most of the operational details remained classified. Then, finally, in 1996, more than 50 years after the war, the United States government formally declassified the full record of the Ghost Army. By then, many of the men were already dead. Of those who were still alive, most were in their 70s and 80s. The story they had been forbidden to tell for half a century could finally be told. It was filmmaker Rick Beyer who took up the cause of bringing the story to light. He produced and directed a documentary called The Ghost Army, which premiered on PBS in May of 2013. He co-authored, with Elizabeth Sales, a book titled The Ghost Army of World War II, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2015, with an updated edition appearing in 2023. Beyer founded the Ghost Army Legacy Project to preserve the unit's history, interview surviving veterans before they passed, and lobby for official recognition. That recognition finally came on March 21, 2024. On that day, in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol, hosted by Speaker Mike Johnson, 3 of the 7 known surviving members of the Ghost Army were presented with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor that the United States Congress can bestow on a civilian or military body. The legislation had been signed into law by President Joe Biden on February 1, 2022, after nearly a decade of work by family members of the veterans and by Rick Beyer. The men receiving the medal that day were Bernie Bluestein, who was 100 years old and traveled from Hoffman Estates, Illinois; John Christman, 99, a demolitions specialist from the 406th Engineer Combat Company who came from Leesburg, New Jersey; and Seymour Nussenbaum, also 100 years old, who had once been an art student at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and who came from Monroe Township, New Jersey. Our mission, Nussenbaum said simply, was to fool the enemy, to put on a big act. The official estimates of how many lives the Ghost Army saved range from 15,000 to 30,000 American servicemen. The deception they performed at Viersen alone is credited with making the Rhine crossing possible at minimal cost. Across more than 20 separate operations during the war, in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, plus the operations conducted in Italy by the 3,133rd Signal Service Company, the men of the Ghost Army drew German fire onto rubber tanks instead of real ones, drew German reserves toward phantom divisions instead of real ones, and bought time and space for real American units to maneuver, attack, and survive. There is a strange and haunting symmetry to what the Ghost Army did. War, in its conventional form, is the application of overwhelming force. Bigger guns, more men, heavier armor. But the Ghost Army succeeded by doing the opposite. They succeeded by being light, by being small, by being clever. They understood that the enemy was not just an army but a system of perception, a network of eyes and ears and radio receivers and intelligence officers, all trying to make sense of an incomplete picture of the battlefield. If you could control what that system saw and heard and intercepted, you could control how it reacted. You could make it defend the wrong river. You could make it shell rubber. You could make it look the wrong way at the moment that mattered most. For German artillery officers standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine in March of 1945, the experience must have been profoundly disorienting. They had done everything right. They had collected intelligence from multiple sources. They had cross-checked aerial photographs against radio intercepts against ground observation. Every channel of information had given them the same answer, and every channel had been wrong. This was the deepest accomplishment of the Ghost Army. They did not just trick the Germans on a single occasion, they corroded the German intelligence picture from the inside. Every time German intelligence officers compared notes from aerial photographs, signals intelligence, and ground observation, they thought they were triangulating the truth from independent sources. In reality, all of those sources had been seeded with material engineered by the men of the 23rd. Multiple independent sources, reinforcing each other, all pointing to the same wrong conclusion. This is something intelligence professionals call source corruption, and it is one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a national security apparatus. And here is perhaps the most remarkable fact of all. There is no evidence that the Germans, during the war or even immediately after it, ever discovered that a dedicated American deception unit existed. They were fooled by the deceptions, repeatedly, comprehensively, but they never learned that the same small group of artists and engineers had been behind so many of the illusions. The men of the 23rd were ghosts in the most complete sense of the word. They left no trace. The Ghost Army did not just deceive the German army. They demonstrated something that would echo through every conflict that followed, into the Cold War, into the wars of the late 20th century, and into the information conflicts of our own age. They demonstrated that perception, in modern warfare, is itself a battlefield, that the enemy's eyes and ears can be weapons turned against him, that painters and designers and theatre people, given the right tools and the right mission, can be as decisive on a battlefield as any tank crew. The men of the Ghost Army did not fire many shots in anger. They did not capture trenches or storm bunkers, but by every reasonable measure, they were among the most effective soldiers America fielded in the European theatre. 3 of them gave their lives. Dozens more were wounded. All of them carried the weight of a secret for 50 years. Today, the legacy of the Ghost Army lives on in several places. The Ghost Army Legacy Project, founded by Rick Beyer, continues to gather oral histories, preserve artifacts, and educate the public. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has produced traveling exhibitions about the unit. The Congressional Gold Medal sits in the official archive of American military honors, alongside those awarded to the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, and the Women Air Force Service pilots. Sketches and paintings made by the soldier artists during the war, in cafes in Luxembourg, on hillsides in France, in field tents in Germany, hang in galleries and museum collections. Each year, fewer of the original Ghost Army veterans remain alive. The men who once impersonated entire divisions, who once made the German army shell pieces of rubber, who once held a long stretch of front line with 1,000 men, are now in their late 90s and over 100 years old. By the time the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded in 2024, only 7 were known to still be living. By the time you watch this video, that number may be smaller still. The duty of remembering them is passing, as it always passes, to the next generations. The story of the Ghost Army is not a story of glory in the conventional military sense. There are no famous last stands here. There are no hills taken at terrible cost. There are no pitched battles whose names enter the textbooks. The men of the Ghost Army did not fight that kind of war. Their war was quieter, stranger, and in some ways more demanding. It required them to be invisible while at the same time being highly visible. It required them to attract enemy fire while having almost no means to fight back. It required them to perform, night after night, in the cold and the rain and the mud of Europe, knowing that the only audience that mattered was an enemy who would, if he ever saw through the act, kill them all. It is a story about what happens when imagination is given the same status as armament, about what happens when a country looks at its artists and its designers and its sound engineers and its theatre kids and says, instead of treating you as decorative, we are going to treat you as essential. We are going to ask you to invent, on the fly, a kind of warfare that has never existed before, and we are going to trust you to save the lives of thousands of men you will never meet, by means that, when this is over, you will not be permitted to describe. It is a story, finally, about the strange grace of being unknown. The men of the Ghost Army did the work, and then they put away the costumes, and then they went home, and then they were silent. They watched their friends in regular combat units receive medals and parades and write memoirs, while they themselves could say nothing. Many of them became famous for what they did after the war, in fashion and in painting and in photography and in design. And the irony is that the public knew their names without knowing the deeper story of the men who carried them. When the Congressional Gold Medal was finally awarded in 2024, the men who walked up to receive it walked slowly. Some used canes. Some were assisted by family. Most of their fellow soldiers were not there to see it, having passed away in the long decades of waiting. But the medal, when it was placed in their hands, represented something that the American military had taken almost 80 years to fully acknowledge. That a small group of men, with rubber tanks and steel wire and an unshakable belief in the power of illusion, had helped win the Second World War. The German artillery officers who stared across the Rhine in March of 1945 never knew the names of the men who had fooled them. They never knew that the tanks they were looking at were inflatable, the sounds they were hearing were recorded, and the radio chatter they were decrypting was a performance. They never knew that the men who had so completely deceived them would go home, take off their uniforms, and spend the rest of their lives painting and designing and photographing and creating, while keeping the deception a perfect secret. That confusion, multiplied across the German command on that long final week of March 1945, was the masterpiece of the Ghost Army. It was the moment when reality itself became unreliable for the Wehrmacht. The moment when their eyes could no longer be trusted, their ears could no longer be trusted, their radios could no longer be trusted, and their carefully built picture of the battlefield could no longer be trusted. It was the moment when art beat armor, when imagination beat artillery. When a small group of American soldiers, most of them barely out of art school, made the German army see things that were not there and miss the things that were. Their story remained a secret for 50 years. It is no longer a secret, and as long as we remember it, the Ghost Army will not be a phantom. They will be what they always were. Real men, real soldiers, real artists, who fought a real war with the strangest weapons ever carried into battle, and who, in the doing of it, redefined what war itself could be.